The front page of the Arizona Territory Gazette fluttered in the dry spring breeze. President Grant pushes reconstruction efforts in the South, read the headline that Sheriff Caldwell skimmed before tossing the paper back onto the counter of the general store. 5 cents for news that arrived 2 weeks late seemed hardly worth it. The sheriff adjusted his brass star and squinted at the growing crowd filling Dry Gulch's main street. April 1871, 6 years since Appomattox, but the war still hung like a shadow over every town from Mississippi to the territories. Dry Gulch had been nothing but a watering hole and a promise when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. Now it stretched to nearly 40 buildings, with the railroad surveyors making promises of prosperity that seemed as substantial as the dust devils dancing at the edge of town. Market day brought the scattered homesteaders and ranchers into the settlement. Women in faded calico dresses inspected bolts of fabric priced at 30 cents a yard. Men congregated around a wagon displaying Sharps carbines going for $20 each. Children darted between stalls selling peaches, tin pots, and strips of jerky for pennies. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer provided rhythm to the chaotic chorus of commerce. Near the center of the square stood a wooden platform. Once used for political speeches and the occasional wedding, today it served a darker purpose. Sheriff Caldwell watched without expression as Walter Harmon dragged his daughter up the steps. The girl moved awkwardly, ankles and wrists bound with rusty chains. Her head was covered by a thick burlap sack that hung past her collarbones. The fabric had weathered to a dirty gray, small eye holes cut at the front, revealing nothing of the face behind it. Her dress, once blue, had faded to the color of a winter sky, its hem caked with the red earth of the territory. Eleanor Harmon stood beside her husband, spine straight as a fence post, eyes sharp with malice. Her gray hair was pulled so tightly into a bun, it seemed to stretch the very skin of her face. She nodded at the gathering crowd. "God made her wrong," she announced to the onlookers, voice carrying across the square. "She is the curse of my womb, a mistake, a punishment." Walter Harmon jerked the chain, causing the girl to stumble to her knees on the rough planks. "This is no daughter of mine," he spat, beard quivering with disgust. "She was born twisted inside and out, brought nothing but shame." The crowd grew. Some watched with idle curiosity, some with undisguised amusement. A few mothers pulled their children away, but more allowed them to stare. A boy of about 9 picked up a stone and weighed it in his hand, eyes fixed on the covered figure. Inside her darkness, Clara Harmon remembered fire. Not the warming kind that filled hearths on winter nights, but the consuming kind that had devoured half her face when she was 5 years old. The Union soldiers had requisitioned their farmhouse during a sweep through the valley. They had been kind enough, even sharing their rations with her. But they had brought kerosene lamps that Clara had never seen before. The fascination of a child, the moment of reaching, the sudden explosion of light and pain. She remembered her mother screaming, not for her daughter but at her, as if Clara had invited the fire to claim her, as if a child could choose such torment. The stone struck Clara on the shoulder, not hard enough to bruise, but with enough force to send a clear message. She did not flinch. After 15 years of darkness and chains, small pains barely registered. $5, Walter Harmon called out, rattling the chain. "Strong back for work. Doesn't eat much." The crowd murmured, but no one stepped forward. Clara felt rather than saw their eyes crawling over her like insects, curious but unwilling to touch something so obviously marked by misfortune. "She reads," Walter added, desperate now. "Educated before the accident. Can keep accounts." A man spat tobacco juice onto the dust. "What good's reading when you look like that?" Eleanor Harmon laughed, a brittle sound like breaking glass. "She's a lesson in God's judgment, living proof of what happens to the wicked." Clara wanted to scream that she had been a child of 5, that reaching for something bright was not wickedness, that no God she could believe in would punish curiosity with a lifetime of pain, but she remained silent. Words had long ago proven useless against her parents' cruelty. Thunder rolled across the square, not from the clear April sky, but from the hooves of an approaching horse. Black as midnight, and standing 17 hands high, the stallion commanded attention even before its rider came into view. The horse slowed as it reached the crowd. People stepped aside instinctively, creating a path toward the platform. The animal bore the unmistakable spotted rump of the Appaloosa breed, favored by cavalry officers who could afford better than the Army-issued mounts. Thomas Blackwell sat tall in the saddle, his presence filling more space than his physical frame, substantial though it was. The years had carved lines into his face like a mapmaker plotting the routes of hard experience. His hat, a battered campaign cover from the war, shaded eyes that missed nothing. The leather of his coat, cracked and worn at the elbows, clung to shoulders broadened by combat and labor. The holster at his hip held a Remington 1858, the weapon of a man who expected to use what he carried. But it was the way he moved that caused people to step back. The fluid economy of a predator. The watchful stillness of a man who had learned to see death coming and step aside just in time. He dismounted with a slight favoring of his left leg. Those who knew the battles could guess Gettysburg or the Wilderness, places where many A-balls had torn through the ranks of the 7th Cavalry and left survivors marked forever. "What town is this?" The voice was low, graveled by years of shouting commands over cannon fire. A man nearby cleared his throat. "Dry Gulch, stranger." Thomas nodded once, surveying the square with the tactical assessment of a scout. 12 buildings facing the main street, 2 alleys offering escape routes. The general store positioned at a corner with clear sightlines. The sheriff watching from the shade of the awning, hand resting casually near his sidearm. And the platform. Thomas walked forward, each step deliberate as he approached the spectacle. The crowd parted without protest. The Harmons stood straighter, sensing a potential buyer for whatever they were selling. Thomas stopped at the edge of the platform. His gaze moved from Walter to Eleanor to the sheriff, who had now drifted closer, then finally settled on the kneeling figure in chains. "How much?" he asked, voice deceptively soft. Walter Harmon's face split into an eager grin. "You want to take it off our hands? $20 and she's yours, worth twice that for farm work alone." Thomas did not blink. "I do not buy people." The grin faltered. Walter stepped forward, boot inches from his daughter's hunched form. "Then keep walking, soldier. This is none of your concern." "I make it my concern." Thomas shifted his weight, right hand now resting casually near the worn grip of his revolver. "When I see a human being treated like livestock." Eleanor Harmon shrieked, the sound piercing the sudden quiet that had fallen over the square. "She is not human. Look at her. God marked her as cursed." Thomas studied the woman for a long moment. "God marks us all in different ways, ma'am. Some scars show on the outside. Some stay hidden where only the bearer knows their shape." He turned back to Walter. "Remove her chains." Walter Harmon laughed, a harsh bark of disbelief. "By whose authority?" "Mine." The word carried the weight of mountains. The sheriff finally stepped forward, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Now see here, Mr. Captain," Thomas corrected. "Captain Thomas Blackwell, United States Cavalry, retired." The sheriff hesitated. The war might be over, but military men carried influence in the territories, especially officers. "Captain, these folks have their rights. This is a family matter." "Is it legal to chain a human being in Arizona territory, Sheriff? Last I heard, the Emancipation Proclamation applied even out here." Walter's face darkened with anger. "She's not a slave. She's property. Damaged goods." Thomas took one step up onto the platform. "No person is property. Not since 1865. Walter grabbed a wooden cane leaning against the railing and swung it toward Thomas's chest. The captain caught it midair with his left hand, his grip tightening until the knuckles whitened. For a moment, the two men stood locked in position. Then Thomas twisted the cane and snapped it cleanly in two. 3 young men pushed forward from the crowd, ranch hands or drifters looking for excitement. They circled the platform, fists clenched. The sheriff made no move to intervene. The first lunged at Thomas from behind. The captain sidestepped, using the man's momentum to send him sprawling across the platform. The second swung a wild haymaker that Thomas ducked beneath, driving an elbow into the attacker's ribs with calculated force. The man dropped to his knees, gasping. The third hesitated, seeing the fate of his companions. Thomas met his eyes, the cold assessment of a man who had faced Confederate charges at Cemetery Ridge. The young man turned and disappeared into the crowd. Silence fell across the square. Even the distant blacksmith's hammer had gone quiet. Thomas turned back to the Harmons, who now stood pressed against the railing. "The chains," he repeated. Walter fumbled with a key from his pocket and unlocked the shackles binding his daughter's ankles and wrists. The iron fell away, revealing skin rubbed raw and scarred from years of confinement. Thomas knelt beside Clara, ignoring the stench of unwashed fabric and the whispers from the crowd. He did not attempt to remove the sack. Instead, he spoke directly to the eye holes, his voice gentle but firm. "I have a ranch 10 miles north. You are welcome there for as long as you wish. No chains, no mockery. The choice is yours." Inside her darkness, Clara heard these words and searched for the lie within them. In 15 years, kindness had always concealed cruelty waiting to emerge. Yet something in this stranger's voice reached past her fear. When Thomas extended his hand, she did not take it immediately. Long seconds passed as the crowd watched the tableau. Then slowly her raw fingers emerged from the folds of her dress and rested in his palm. Thomas helped her to her feet. Still not touching the sack, he guided her down the steps. When they reached his horse, he lifted her carefully onto the saddle. Clara weighed no more than a child, years of neglect having stripped away everything but essential survival. "Where are you taking her?" someone called from the crowd. Thomas mounted behind Clara, one arm securing her while the other took the reins. He looked out at the faces staring back at him, some curious, some hostile, most simply empty of understanding. "Home," he said simply, and turned the horse toward the north road. As they rode away, Sheriff Caldwell approached Walter Harmon, who stood seething beside the now empty chains. "You want me to go after them? Bring her back?" Walter spat onto the platform. "Let him have the abomination. She was nothing but a drain." Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she watched the horse disappear from view. "That man will regret his interference, mark my words." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Might be worth remembering that name. Blackwell. There's talk of railroad coming through these parts. Land values changing." He fingered his badge. "Might be useful to know who owns what." Walter Harmon's expression shifted from rage to calculation. "Indeed, Sheriff. Indeed." The sun climbed higher as Thomas guided the Appaloosa away from Dry Gulch. Clara sat rigid before him, every muscle tense as if expecting a blow or a trick. He made no attempt to engage her in conversation, understanding that words meant little against years of mistreatment. Instead, he pointed out landmarks as they traveled. The massive oak that marked the boundary of Turner's property. The creek that ran full in spring, but would be bone dry by August. The distant mountains where Apache scouts still watched the encroaching settlements. "That rock formation looks like a sleeping bear," he said, nodding toward a hillside. "My son Jackson calls it Bear Mountain, though that is not its proper name." Clara remained silent, but her head turned slightly toward the formation. Their path took them through open country where cavalry tactics would favor the defender. Thomas noted clearings for fields of fire, natural barriers for cover, approaches that would need to be watched. 6 years of peace had not erased the battlefield calculations that kept men alive. As they rode, Thomas became aware of Clara studying him from behind her mask, not directly, but in the careful way of those accustomed to observing without being caught. "The leg was Gettysburg," he said, answering the unasked question. "Rebel sharpshooter during Pickett's charge. The hands were later, pulling men from burning wagons after a supply train was ambushed." He felt her stiffen at the mention of fire. "Burns heal differently for each person," he continued. "Some barely show after time. Others mark us forever. Either way, they are just evidence that we survived something that tried to destroy us." A mile passed in silence before Clara's voice emerged, raspy from disuse. "How did you know I was burned?" Thomas kept his eyes on the horizon. "I was at Antietam, saw artillery shells ignite a wheat field with men inside it. The survivors had a certain way of flinching from open flames. You have the same response." Another mile passed. Clara shifted in the saddle, unused to the freedom of movement after years of restraint. "Why help me?" Thomas considered the question as the horse navigated a shallow stream crossing. "During the war, I watched good men do terrible things because others stood by and did nothing. I promised myself that if I survived, I would not be the man who looks away." "You have children," Clara observed. "They might be afraid of this." She gestured toward her covered face. "Children fear what they are taught to fear," Thomas replied. "Mine have been taught to judge people by their actions, not their appearances." They rode over a gentle rise. and the Blackwell Ranch appeared before them. Not grand, but solidly built, the main house stood 2 stories tall with a wide porch facing south. A barn and several outbuildings formed a rough square with the house, creating a defensible perimeter. A corral held 3 horses that raised their heads at the approach of the Appaloosa. Fields stretched behind the structures, young shoots of corn barely visible in the freshly turned earth. A creek ran along the eastern boundary, feeding a small pond before continuing south. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the scent of cooking. Thomas slowed the horse as they approached, giving Clara time to absorb the sight of what would be her new home if she chose to stay. "My wife Catherine died 3 years ago," he said quietly. "Fever took her while I was away, helping establish Fort McDowell. The twins were just born. Jackson was 3. I came back to bury her and raise them alone." Clara turned slightly toward him. "I am sorry for your loss." Thomas nodded once. "Every day I wake wondering if I could have saved her had I been here. Every night I sleep knowing I will never have an answer." As they approached, 3 children emerged onto the porch. The oldest, a boy of about 6, carried himself with the serious demeanor of a child who had assumed responsibilities beyond his years. Beside him stood twin girls, perhaps 4 years old, with matching braids and identical expressions of curiosity. Thomas dismounted, then helped Clara down. She stood unsteadily, unaccustomed to solid ground after the long ride. "Jackson," Thomas called. "Ruth, Rebecca, come meet our guest." The children approached cautiously. Jackson led his sisters, positioning himself slightly ahead as if prepared to protect them if necessary. "This is Miss Clara," Thomas said. "She will be staying with us for a while." Jackson studied Clara's covered face, head tilted in assessment rather than fear. "Does your head hurt under there?" he asked. Clara did not answer, but her hands rose slightly toward the burlap. "Miss Clara prefers to keep her face covered for now," Thomas explained. "We will respect that choice." Ruth tugged at her father's sleeve. "Is she a ghost?" Thomas knelt to eye level with his daughter. "No, she is a person who has been treated poorly. We will show her that not everyone in this world is cruel. Can you do that?" The twins nodded solemnly. "Jackson, please show Miss Clara to the spare room. Ruth and Rebecca, fetch fresh water for washing." The children moved with practiced efficiency, accustomed to helping around the ranch. Jackson approached Clara and gestured toward the house. "This way, Miss Clara," he said with the formal politeness his father had taught him. "The room has a window that faces the creek. In the morning you can see deer drinking before the sun gets high." Clara followed the boy, her movements hesitant but determined. At the threshold of the house, she paused and turned back toward Thomas, who remained by the horse. Though no words passed between them, an understanding formed in that moment. She had accepted his offer of sanctuary. He had extended protection without condition. Whatever came next would build upon this fragile foundation of trust. Inside the Blackwell home, Clara stood in the center of a modest but clean bedroom. A bed with iron frame occupied one wall, covered by a quilt pieced together from worn clothing. A small table beside it held a kerosene lamp, the sight of which caused her to step backward involuntarily. Jackson noticed her reaction. "We can use candles instead," he said, indicating a drawer in the table. "Father says always have alternatives." Clara nodded once, the first acknowledgement she had offered. "Supper is rabbit stew," Jackson continued. "Father shot 2 yesterday. Rebecca wanted to keep them as pets, but Father said we need the meat more than pets." He pointed to a wooden screen in the corner. "You can change behind there if you want. There are dresses in the trunk that belong to—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. "Your mother," Clara said, her voice emerging rough from disuse. Jackson nodded, surprised to hear her speak. "Yes, she died when the twins were born." Clara moved to the window and looked out at the land stretching toward distant mountains. "This is a good place," she whispered, more to herself than the boy. "Father built most of it himself after the war," Jackson said with pride. "He says a man should create more than he destroys in a lifetime." Clara turned back to him, the eye holes of her mask revealing nothing of her expression. "Your father is an unusual man." "The best kind," Jackson agreed seriously. "He never breaks his word." After Jackson left, Clara explored the room with cautious movements. The trunk at the foot of the bed contained dresses of simple but good quality. She ran her fingers over the fabric, remembering when such ordinary pleasures had been denied her. Beside the trunk stood a bookshelf with a dozen volumes, their spines showing the wear of frequent reading. Clara selected one and opened it carefully. Poems by Emily Dickinson. The pages fell open to a well-read passage. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. A sound at the door made her close the book hastily. Rebecca stood there carrying a pitcher of water with both hands, her small face intensely focused on not spilling a drop. "For washing," the little girl announced, setting the pitcher on a stand near the screen. She lingered, eyes fixed on Clara's masked face. "Does it hurt?" Clara hesitated. "Not anymore." Rebecca nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I fell from the apple tree last summer. My arm hurt lots. Then it stopped." She held up her arm to demonstrate its current painlessness. "Father says hurts go away if you are brave." "Your father is wise," Clara said softly. Rebecca beamed. "He knows everything." She skipped from the room, mission accomplished. Clara turned back to the window. A deer had emerged from the woods to drink from the creek, just as Jackson had promised. She watched it, marveling at how such ordinary beauty had been absent from her life for so long. The evening meal unfolded with the quiet efficiency of a family accustomed to routine. Thomas served stew into wooden bowls, passing them around the table where the twins sat on books to reach their plates. Jackson recounted the day's events while helping his sisters with their food. Clara sat slightly apart, lifting the bottom edge of her sack just enough to take small bites. Thomas made no comment on this arrangement, treating it as perfectly ordinary. After the meal, the children cleared the table while Thomas retrieved a leather journal from a shelf. He sat by the fire, making entries in a precise hand. Clara watched from her corner, noting the careful way he formed each letter, the methodical documentation of the day. "Can you read?" Ruth asked, appearing suddenly at Clara's side. "Yes," Clara answered. "I learned before." She touched the edge of her mask. "Father teaches us," Ruth said proudly. "Jackson can read whole books now. I know letters." Clara nodded. "That is very good." "Will you help teach me?" Ruth asked, eyes wide with hope. "Father says more teachers make stronger learning." Before Clara could answer, Rebecca joined them. "Tell us a story," she demanded. "I do not know many stories," Clara said. "Make one up," Rebecca suggested, as if this were the simplest solution in the world. Clara hesitated, then began slowly. "Once there was a girl who lived in darkness." The twins settled at her feet, faces upturned and eager. Jackson paused in his chores to listen. Even Thomas set aside his journal, though he pretended to continue writing. "She thought the darkness was all there would ever be," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "But one day a kind stranger showed her there was still light in the world. And the girl discovered that even in the darkest places, hope could grow." Later, when the children had been tucked into bed, Thomas checked the perimeter of the property with military precision. Each window, each door, each potential entry point received his attention. His rifle stood by the front door, loaded and ready. 2 spare revolvers hung on pegs nearby, out of children's reach, but accessible in seconds. Clara observed these security measures with understanding. The world contained dangers requiring vigilance, different from the dangers she had known, perhaps, but no less real. When Thomas returned to the main room, Clara had moved to stand near the hearth. The flames cast bizarre shadows through her mask onto the wall behind her. "There are clean clothes in the trunk," Thomas said, keeping a respectful distance. "Catherine was taller than you, but her dresses can be altered." Clara nodded. "Thank you for your kindness, Captain Blackwell." "Thomas," he corrected gently, "I left Captain buried at Appomattox alongside too many good men." Clara turned toward him, firelight glinting through the rough eye holes. "Why did you really intervene today?" Thomas considered the question, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms mapped with scars. "During the war, I watched men become animals. I promised myself that if I survived, I would never stand by while someone suffered unnecessarily." His voice remained steady, but Clara sensed depths beneath the words. "You could have simply passed by." "I could have," he agreed, "but then I would not be the man I am trying to become." He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a stack of papers, maps, by the look of them, carefully annotated in the same precise handwriting as his journal. "This land," he said, spreading a survey map on the table, "is mine by legal claim filed 3 years ago with the Territorial Office. 20 sections, with water rights to the creek. Jackson and the twins will inherit it equally when they come of age. Clara approached cautiously, studying the document. Why show me this? Thomas traced the boundary lines with a scarred finger. So you understand that this place is secure. The Harmons have no claim here. No one can take it from us. The word us hung in the air between them, an inclusion Clara had not expected. I cannot promise you happiness, Thomas continued, but I can promise safety, for as long as you choose to remain. Clara touched the edge of the map, finger tracing the flow of the creek that cut through the property. I have known neither, she admitted softly. Thomas rolled the map carefully and returned it to a metal tube. Then perhaps it is time you experienced both. He paused, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. I found this after Catherine died. It belonged to her mother. He placed a silver thimble on the table. She would have wanted someone to use it who needed it, for mending or altering dresses. The simple gift nearly undid Clara's composure. Such a small thing, yet it represented inclusion, utility, purpose, things long denied her. Thank you, she whispered, not trusting her voice for more. Thomas nodded once and turned toward his room. At the doorway, he paused. Jackson has nightmares sometimes, about his mother. If you hear him in the night, a simple touch on the shoulder usually calms him. The twins sleep through anything. With that, he left Clara alone with the silver thimble gleaming in the firelight. That night, Clara sat by her window long after the household had fallen silent. She removed the sack carefully, setting it aside on the bed. The cool night air touched her scarred skin for the first time in years. She breathed deeply, eyes closed, allowing herself this small freedom in the darkness where no one could see. The right side of her face remained smooth, untouched by the fire that had claimed the left. The contrast made the damage seem more severe than it was. She traced the ridges of scar tissue with tentative fingers, reacquainting herself with a face she had not seen in years. The mirror on the dresser remained face down. She was not ready for that yet. Instead, she looked out at the star-filled sky, counting pinpricks of light until sleep finally claimed her. Her dreams, for the first time in memory, contained no fire, only open fields and the sound of children's laughter. Dawn broke with the crowing of a rooster. Clara woke disoriented, momentarily panicked by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory returned, the marketplace, the cavalry officer, the journey to this place. She quickly replaced the burlap sack over her head, securing it with practiced movements. The freedom of the night was past. Daylight demanded armor. The house was already active. Thomas's voice carried from outside, issuing instructions to Jackson about feeding the livestock. The twins chattered in the kitchen, setting the table for breakfast with more enthusiasm than precision. Clara emerged cautiously from her room. Ruth spotted her first and waved excitedly, a fork clutched in her small hand. Miss Clara, Father made Johnny cakes, Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. With molasses. Clara moved toward the kitchen, uncertain of her place in this morning ritual. The smell of coffee and cornmeal filled the warm room. A cast-iron skillet sizzled on the stove. Thomas turned from the stove, spatula in hand. He nodded a greeting, neither surprised nor disturbed by her appearance. Coffee? Please, Clara said, the simple exchange feeling strangely momentous. Thomas poured coffee into a chipped mug and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed during the exchange. Neither commented on the contact. Father says you're staying forever, Rebecca announced, mouth full of Johnny cake. Thomas raised an eyebrow. I said Miss Clara is welcome to stay as long as she wishes. Forever, Rebecca repeated with childish certainty. Clara sipped her coffee, using the moment to compose herself. I would like to earn my keep, she said finally. I can cook, sew, keep accounts. Thomas flipped another Johnny cake onto a plate. There is always work on a ranch. You will find your place. Can Miss Clara help with my reading lesson? Jackson asked, entering from outside, his hands freshly washed. Thomas glanced at Clara, careful not to press. If she wishes. Clara nodded. I would like that. After breakfast, Thomas showed Clara around the property. The barn housed not only horses, but a milk cow, carefully tended garden tools, and a workbench where Thomas repaired everything from harnesses to furniture. A smokehouse stood nearby, currently empty, but ready for the fall hunting season. The chicken coop, vegetable garden, and fruit trees completed the self-sufficient homestead. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles east, Thomas explained as they walked. The Turners. Good people. Their son fought with the 5th Ohio, lost an arm at Shiloh. Clara listened attentively, noting how Thomas mapped the territory in terms of defensive positions, water sources, and possible threats. The habits of a military man translated to civilian life. The creek runs year-round, even in drought, he continued. That's why I chose this land. Water rights are the most valuable asset in the territory. They stopped at the edge of the creek, watching the clear water flow over smooth stones. Birds darted among the willows growing along the bank. The peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the chaos of Clara's previous life. Your children are remarkable, she said, so resilient after losing their mother. Thomas nodded, eyes on the flowing water. Children adapt better than adults. They live in the present. The past does not haunt them the way it does us. Clara turned toward him. And does it haunt you, the bunch of us? Thomas met her gaze through the eye holes of her mask. Every day. The men I couldn't save. The battles we should have lost. The wife I wasn't here to protect. He paused. But I cannot allow those ghosts to consume me. The children need more than a shadow of a father. Clara understood. Her own ghosts rattled their chains daily. They walked back toward the house in companionable silence. At the porch steps, Thomas paused. Your parents may come looking for you. Not out of concern, but out of spite. Clara stiffened. They never wanted me. Only what they could gain from exhibiting me. Thomas's expression hardened. Nevertheless, they may try to assert their claim. The law is imperfect when it comes to such matters. I am 20 years old, Clara said, legally an adult. Yes, but they might claim you are not of sound mind. The sheriff seemed willing to support whatever story brought him the most advantage. Clara's hands clenched into fists. I am not insane. I know that, Thomas assured her. But frontier justice is often determined more by influence than fact. If they come, I will protect you. But you should be prepared. Clara nodded. I have been their prisoner for 15 years. I will not go back. Thomas rested his hand briefly on her shoulder, the first deliberate contact he had initiated. This is your home now if you want it. No one will take you from here against your will. That afternoon, Clara sat with Jackson on the porch, a worn primer open between them. The boy read carefully, sounding out the more difficult words with determination. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy bow, he finished triumphantly. Very good, Clara praised. That sentence contains every letter of the alphabet. Jackson looked up at her with newfound respect. Really? Clara nodded. It is a pangram. Writers use it to test typewriters and printing presses. What's a typewriter? Jackson asked. Clara described the machine she had once seen in a newspaper office before her accident. Jackson listened with rapt attention, his imagination fired by the concept. Father says machines will change everything, he said. He reads scientific journals, says the future belongs to those who understand progress. Clara was struck by the contradiction Thomas represented, a cavalry officer who embraced the future while maintaining traditions of honor and duty from the past. The lesson continued until Ruth and Rebecca demanded their turn for attention. Clara found herself teaching them a clapping game she remembered from her childhood. Their delighted laughter drew Thomas from the barn where he had been repairing a broken harness. He stood watching the scene, his expression unreadable. When Clara noticed his presence, she faltered, suddenly self-conscious. Thomas nodded once, approval evident in his eyes, then returned to his work. That evening, after another simple but satisfying meal, Thomas brought out a fiddle. The instrument was old but well-maintained, its wood polished by years of handling. Father plays for us every Wednesday, Jackson explained to Clara. It was Mother's favorite night. Thomas tuned the strings carefully, then began to play. Not a joyful tune, but not mournful either. Something that spoke of endurance and quiet strength. The children sat entranced, even the normally restless twins. Clara closed her eyes behind her mask, allowing the music to wash over her. How long since she had experienced beauty without pain attached to it? The simple pleasure of melody in a warm room surrounded by kind people felt almost overwhelming after so many years of deprivation. When the music ended, Thomas set the fiddle without comment. The ritual complete, the children prepared for bed with practiced efficiency. Jackson helped the twins with their night clothes while Thomas checked the property one final time. Clara stood to help clear the table, but Ruth tugged at her dress. Will you tell us another story about the girl in the darkness? Clara hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but a short one. It is late. The twins settled eagerly on the small rug before the hearth. Jackson joined them, though he pretended it was only to supervise his sisters. The girl in the darkness had forgotten what sunlight felt like, Clara began. She had forgotten the colors of flowers and the sound of laughter. But one day she heard children playing beyond her wall, and she remembered that the world contained joy, even if she could not see it. Thomas returned as she spoke, standing quietly in the doorway listening. The children reminded her that darkness is not forever, Clara continued, that every night, no matter how long, eventually gives way to dawn. After the children were tucked into bed, Clara remained by the fire, lost in thought. Thomas joined her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. You have a gift with them, he observed, offering her one of the mugs. Clara accepted it, careful to maintain the distance that seemed to comfort them both. They make it easy. They have not learned to fear differences yet. They never will, Thomas said firmly. Not in this house. They sat in silence for a time, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Clara spoke. Why did you really bring me here? The truth. Thomas considered the question, turning his coffee mug in scarred hands. When I returned from the war, I was a different man. Harder, colder. Catherine helped me find my way back to humanity. After she died, I began to lose that path again. He looked up at Clara. Today in the square, I saw someone who needed the same chance I was given. A way back from darkness. Clara absorbed his words, understanding the deeper current beneath them. And if I cannot find my way back? Thomas set his mug aside. Then you will have a safe place to remain exactly as you are. No judgment, no expectations. Just a room of your own and quiet respect. The simplicity of the offer brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes, safely hidden behind her mask. Thank you. Thomas nodded once, then stood. Tomorrow I must ride to Turner's place to help with a well they're digging. I'll be gone most of the day. Jackson knows the routine. The rifle over the door is loaded. 5th board from the right under the window is loose. There's a revolver hidden there. Clara stared at him, surprised by this information. The territory can be dangerous, Thomas explained. Indians mostly keep to the treaties now, but renegade bands sometimes raid isolated homesteads. And there are always men who think remote ranches with women and children make easy targets. Clara nodded. I understand. I trust you with my children's safety, Thomas said simply. That is not something I would entrust to many. The weight of that trust settled on Clara's shoulders. Not a burden, but a gift. For 15 years, she had been treated as less than human. Now this man, this stranger who owed her nothing, had judged her worthy of his most precious responsibility. I will protect them, she promised. Thomas smiled slightly, the expression transforming his weathered face. I know you will. After Thomas retired to his room, Clara stood alone in the quiet house. The children's soft breathing carried from their bedroom. The occasional crackle of embers in the hearth punctuated the silence. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Clara moved to the window and looked out at the land bathed in moonlight. Different from the darkness she had known for 15 years. This darkness held possibility rather than confinement. She reached up and touched the rough fabric covering her face. Not ready to remove it. Not yet. But perhaps someday. For tonight it was enough to stand unshackled, looking out at tomorrow. The morning routine on the Blackwell Ranch unfolded with military precision. Thomas rose before dawn, checked the perimeter of the property, then began chores before the sun broke over the eastern hills. Jackson followed his father like a shadow, small hands mimicking larger ones, learning through observation and practice. Clara woke to the sounds of life outside her window. The low murmur of Thomas's voice giving instructions. The clatter of buckets. The impatient lowing of the milk cow. So different from the hollow silence of her parents' house, where sound itself had seemed forbidden. She dressed quickly, selecting one of Catherine Blackwell's simpler dresses. The fabric hung loose on her frame, evidence of years of deprivation. but the quality of the material felt luxurious against her skin. She adjusted her burlap mask, securing it carefully before venturing into the common areas of the house. The twins were still sleeping, tangled together like puppies in their shared bed. Clara paused in their doorway, watching the rise and fall of their small chests, marveling at their innocence. To them, the world remained a place of wonder rather than fear. In the kitchen, Clara assessed the stores with a practical eye. Cornmeal, flour, salt pork, dried beans, coffee. Simple provisions that could be transformed into sustaining meals. She had learned to cook by listening at the kitchen door, observing the family's hired help prepare meals she was rarely allowed to share. By the time Thomas and Jackson returned from the barn, Clara had coffee brewing, biscuits in the oven, and salt pork frying in a cast-iron skillet. Thomas paused in the doorway, the scent of hot coffee momentarily displacing his habitual vigilance. He nodded a greeting, neither commenting on her industry nor seeming surprised by it. "The Turner's well needs reinforcement before the summer dry season," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "I'll be gone most of the day. Jackson knows which chores must be completed." Clara nodded, accepting his matter-of-fact delegation of household authority. "We will manage well enough." Jackson approached the stove, eyeing the biscuits with undisguised interest. "Those smell better than father's," he whispered conspiratorially. Thomas raised an eyebrow but did not contradict his son. "A surgeon once told me my hands were better suited for field dressings than pastry." A hint of humor in his voice caught Clara by surprise. This man contained multitudes beneath his stoic exterior. Soldier and father, protector and nurturer, hard as granite in the town square, yet capable of playing fiddle music that spoke of deep emotion. The twins appeared, hair tousled from sleep, drawn by the aroma of breakfast. They climbed onto chairs stacked with books to reach the table, watching with fascination as Clara lifted the bottom edge of her mask just enough to sip her coffee. "Does your face get hot under there?" Ruth asked, practical curiosity overcoming manners. Before Clara could respond, Thomas intervened gently. "Some questions we keep to ourselves, Ruth. Everyone has the right to privacy." Ruth considered this new information seriously. "Like how Rebecca still wets the bed sometimes?" Rebecca's face flushed crimson. "I do not." "That is exactly the kind of private matter you don't discuss at breakfast," Thomas confirmed, giving Ruth a meaningful look while sparing Rebecca further embarrassment. The remainder of the meal passed with Thomas outlining the day's tasks. The vegetable garden needed weeding. The chicken coop required fresh straw. Water must be hauled from the creek for laundry. Clara listened attentively, mentally cataloging the rhythms and responsibilities of the household. After 15 years of enforced idleness, the prospect of productive work felt like liberation rather than burden. As Thomas prepared to leave, he paused beside Clara, voice lowered for her ears alone. "The rifle is loaded, fifth floorboard from the right." Clara nodded, understanding the weight of trust he placed in her. "We will be fine." Thomas studied her for a moment, then turned to Jackson. "You're the man of the house until I return." The boy straightened, shoulders squaring with responsibility. "Yes, sir." Clara watched from the porch as Thomas rode away, the powerful Appaloosa eating up ground with efficient strides. Only when horse and rider disappeared over the rise did she turn to face the day ahead. Jackson stood beside her, unusually solemn. "Father says trouble comes when you least expect it." Clara looked down at the boy, recognizing the weight he carried. Too young for such responsibility, yet rising to meet it with determination that mirrored his father's. "Your father is a wise man," she said, "but today will bring no trouble that we cannot handle together." The morning passed in a rhythm of chores and lessons. Clara discovered that physical labor provided a curious freedom. The repetitive motions of scrubbing laundry against the washboard allowed her mind to wander beyond the confines of her mask. The satisfying progress of a freshly weeded garden row gave tangible evidence of her worth. The children worked alongside her, Jackson serious and methodical, the twins more enthusiastic than effective. Clara found herself adapting her instructions to each child's temperament. Jackson responded to clear explanation and demonstration. Ruth preferred to understand the reasoning behind tasks. Rebecca learned best through stories and imagination. By midday, the most pressing chores were complete. Clara prepared a simple meal of cold biscuits and honey, which the children devoured as if it were a feast. Afterward, while the twins napped in the heat of the day, Jackson brought his reading primer to Clara on the porch. "Father says education is more valuable than gold," the boy explained, settling beside her on the wooden steps. "He reads to us every night, even when he's tired." Clara opened the worn book, recognizing passages she had studied in her own childhood. "Your father wants to give you choices he may not have had." Jackson nodded seriously. "He says the war taught him that knowledge is the only thing no one can take from you." They worked through several pages, Jackson sounding out difficult words with determination. Clara found herself drawing on teaching techniques she had observed through doorways and windows during her confinement, adapting them to this earnest boy's needs. When Jackson excused himself to check the horses as his father had instructed, Clara remained on the porch, savoring the unusual sensation of usefulness. For 15 years, she had existed as a burden, a shameful secret, a living reminder of tragedy. Now, in the space of a single day, she had become a contributor, a teacher, perhaps in some small way a friend to these children. The afternoon brought gathering clouds from the west. Clara studied them with a practiced eye, recognizing the signs of approaching weather. Not a dangerous storm, but enough rain to justify moving the remaining laundry indoors. As she pinned the last sheet to the line strung across the porch, Clara noticed a figure on horseback approaching from the direction of town. Not Thomas, whose broad-shouldered silhouette she would have recognized instantly. This rider was smaller, hunched forward in the saddle as if conserving energy for a long journey. Clara stepped back into the shadow of the porch, instinctively seeking concealment. Jackson appeared from the barn, alerted by the same sixth sense for approaching visitors that his father possessed. "Stay with your sisters," Clara instructed, her voice calm despite the sudden acceleration of her pulse. "Close the door." Jackson nodded once, no questions asked, and disappeared into the house. Clara heard the solid thunk of the wooden bar falling into place across the door. Thomas had trained his children well. The rider approached slowly, making no attempt at stealth. As the figure drew closer, Clara recognized the slouched posture of age rather than deception. An elderly man, perhaps 70, with a white beard and faded cavalry hat that had seen better days decades ago. He reined his horse at the edge of the yard, keeping a respectful distance from the house. "Hello, the house," he called, voice thin but carrying. "Name's Josiah Parker, friend of Thomas Blackwell from the 7th. Clara remained silent, one hand near the doorframe where she could retreat quickly if necessary. The old man squinted toward the porch. "Thomas around? Got a message from town." "He is not here at present," Clara replied, careful to keep her voice neutral. "Expected back before evening." Josiah Parker nodded, seeming unsurprised. "Mind if I water my horse? Been a long ride from Dry Gulch?" Clara hesitated, weighing hospitality against caution. "The trough is by the barn," she finally said. "You are welcome to it." "Much obliged, ma'am." The old cavalryman dismounted with the stiff movements of arthritic joints and led his horse toward the water trough. "Been riding with Thomas since Shiloh," he commented, conversationally. "Saved my life at Missionary Ridge. Devil of a fight, that was." Clara remained vigilant, but detected no threat from the weathered veteran. "You were in the same unit?" "7th Cavalry. Thomas made captain after Gettysburg, youngest in the regiment." Josiah allowed his horse to drink deeply from the trough. "Finest officer I ever served under. Never asked a man to do what he wouldn't do himself." The description aligned with what Clara had observed of Thomas Blackwell, a natural leader who led by example rather than command. "What brings you from town?" she asked, maintaining a safe distance. Josiah straightened, his expression growing serious. "Sheriff was asking questions about Thomas after you folks left yesterday. Wanted to know about his claim to the land, water rights, legal standing." The old man spat into the dust. "Got a bad feeling about it. Sheriff's been thick as thieves with some railroad men lately." Clara absorbed this information, connecting it to Thomas's concerns about her parents attempting to reclaim her. "The sheriff has no jurisdiction here. Territory law is a flexible thing, ma'am, especially when money's involved." Josiah adjusted his hat against the strengthening wind. "Railroads pushing through soon. Land with water rights suddenly worth 10 times what it was." The implications hung in the air between them. Thomas Blackwell's 20 sections with reliable water would be valuable to interests pushing westward. An unmarried man with 3 small children might be considered vulnerable, especially if complicated by harboring a woman claimed as mentally incompetent by her family. I appreciate the warning, Clara said finally. I will ensure Thomas receives your message. Josiah nodded, remounting with difficulty. Tell him Josiah says to watch his back. And maybe pay a visit to Judge Wilson in Prescott. Man owes Thomas a favor from the war. With that cryptic advice, the old cavalryman turned his horse and rode away, pace unhurried despite the darkening sky. Clara watched until he disappeared from view, then returned to the house. She wrapped a specific pattern on the door, the signal Thomas had established to identify family members. Jackson opened the door immediately, the loaded rifle from above the mantel held competently in his small hands. The twins peered anxiously from behind their brother. All is well, Clara assured them, impressed by their discipline. The visitor was a friend of your father's. A warning, nothing more. Jackson lowered the rifle carefully, engaging the safety mechanism as Thomas had doubtless taught him. What kind of warning? Clara considered how much to share with the children. Your father's land may be of interest to people in town. Nothing to fear, but something he should know. The boy nodded, accepting her edited explanation. Father says our land is our future. He won't let anyone take it. No, he will not, Clara agreed, helping Ruth and Rebecca set the table for the evening meal. Your father strikes me as a man who protects what he values. The afternoon passed without further incident. Rain arrived with the soft patter of blessing rather than the violence of threat. Clara used the indoor time to begin altering one of Catherine's dresses, reducing the waist and shortening the hem to suit her smaller frame. The twins watched with fascination as she created order from excess fabric. Mother made our quilt, Rebecca said, pointing to the colorful patchwork covering their bed. Father says she put magic in every stitch. Not real magic, Ruth corrected with elder twin authority. Just love magic. Clara nodded, threading a needle with practiced precision. The best kind. By the time Thomas returned, the rain had passed, leaving behind the clean scent of wet earth and refreshed vegetation. The sun emerged beneath the western clouds, painting the landscape in golden light. Clara heard the Appaloosas approach before Thomas appeared, the distinctive rhythm of hoofbeats announcing his return. Jackson rushed to the door, eager to report the successful completion of chores and the unexpected visitor. Clara remained by the fire, conscious suddenly of her uncertain position in this household. Neither servant nor family, neither hidden nor revealed. Thomas listened to Jackson's report with grave attention, asking clarifying questions about Josiah Parker's visit and message. His eyes found Clara across the room, acknowledging her management of the situation with a slight nod. After supper, when the children were occupied with their nightly ablutions, Thomas joined Clara on the porch. The evening air carried the lingering moisture of rain, fresh and cool against the exposed skin of their hands and necks. Josiah Parker was my sergeant during the war, Thomas explained, voice pitched low to avoid carrying to the children inside. Not given to unnecessary warnings. Clara nodded, hands folded in her lap. He mentioned to Judge Wilson in Prescott, said the man owed you a favor. Thomas's expression revealed nothing, but Clara sensed tension in the set of his shoulders. James Wilson was my commanding officer at Gettysburg, now a territorial judge with considerable influence. Your land, Clara began carefully, it has a value beyond farming. The water rights, Thomas confirmed, critical for the railroad steam engines. I knew when I filed my claim that it would eventually become contentious. And my presence complicates matters. Thomas turned toward her, eyes meeting the dark eye holes of her mask. Your presence is not the complication. The greed of men like your father and Sheriff Caldwell is the true problem. Clara absorbed his words, weighing their implications. I could leave, remove the pretext they might use against you. No. The single word carried absolute finality. This is your home now, if you wish it to be. I do not surrender what is right because it becomes difficult. The echo of the cavalry officer resonated in his tone, the man who had held the line at Cemetery Ridge against impossible odds. Clara recognized the steel beneath his quiet exterior, the uncompromising core that had drawn her to accept his offer of sanctuary. I have seen enough injustice, Thomas continued. I will not participate in more by sending you back to people who treated you as less than human. Clara felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading beneath her breastbone. Not gratitude precisely, but something more complex. Recognition, perhaps. The sensation of being seen as a person of value rather than a burden to be endured. Then we face whatever comes together, she said simply. Thomas nodded once. Acceptance of an alliance formed in shared purpose. Indeed we do. The following days established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Clara assumed a responsibility for household matters that Thomas had managed competently, but without joy. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, gardening. Tasks that had once been her mother's domain became Clara's province, not by expectation, but by choice. The children adapted to her presence with the remarkable flexibility of youth. Jackson sought her assistance with reading and arithmetic lessons, his natural intelligence flourishing under individualized attention. The twins adopted her as a source of stories and gentle guidance, their initial curiosity about her covered face fading into acceptance of her as simply Miss Clara. Thomas continued his daily work on the ranch, repairing fences, tending livestock, planning for crops that would sustain them through the winter. Clara noticed his increased vigilance, additional checks of the property perimeter, more frequent maintenance of weapons kept strategically throughout the house. On the fourth morning, Clara woke before dawn, disturbed by a sound she couldn't immediately identify. She lay still, listening intently through the rough fabric covering her ears. There, a soft whimper from the children's room. Clara rose quietly and moved through the darkened house with growing confidence in her surroundings. The door to the children's room stood ajar, allowing her to see Jackson thrashing beneath his quilt, caught in the grip of nightmare. She approached cautiously, remembering Thomas's advice about the boy's dreams. Jackson's face contorted with fear, small hands clutching the bedclothes as if holding onto a cliff edge. "Mother," he moaned, the word escaping like a prayer. "Don't go." Clara's heart constricted at the naked pain in the child's voice. She reached out gently, resting her hand on his shoulder as Thomas had instructed. "Shh," she soothed. "You are safe, Jackson." The boy's eyes opened, disoriented and glazed with remembered sorrow. "Miss Clara?" "Yes," she confirmed, voice soft to avoid waking the twins. "Just a dream, Jackson. All is well." He blinked, reality slowly replacing whatever horror had gripped him in sleep. "I saw her dying again," he whispered. The blood wouldn't stop. Clara understood then. Jackson had witnessed his mother's death during childbirth. No wonder Thomas was so protective of the boy, who carried memories no 6-year-old should possess. She sat carefully on the edge of his bed. "Would you like to talk about it? Sometimes naming fears reduces their power." Jackson shook his head, then hesitated. "Father never talks about her. I think it hurts him too much." "Loss affects people differently," Clara said carefully. "Some find comfort in speaking of those they've lost. Others need silence to heal." "Do you talk about your loss?" Jackson asked with a child's directness. Clara considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I lost myself for many years," she said finally. "I am only now learning to speak of that loss." Jackson nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Father says some wounds heal clean, others leave scars that remind us where we've been." "Your father is a wise man," Clara observed, not for the first time. "He says I look like her," Jackson confided. "Mother, he keeps her picture in his journal, but he thinks I don't know about it." Clara smoothed the quilt around the boy's shoulders. "Would you like to tell me about her? What you remember?" Jackson's face softened with recollection. "She smelled like lavender, and she sang all the time, even when she was working. Father would pretend it bothered him, but sometimes I caught him smiling when she wasn't looking." Clara listened as Jackson shared fragments of memory, precious glimpses of Catherine Blackwell preserved in her son's heart. The woman emerged through his words, spirited, kind, practical, beloved. Thomas had lost not just a wife, but a true partner in creating this remote haven. When Jackson finally drifted back to sleep, Clara remained beside him, reflecting on the complex tapestry of loss and recovery that defined the Blackwell household. Thomas carried his grief like internal scars, visible only in unguarded moments. Jackson processed his through nightmares and carefully preserved memories. The twins, too young to truly remember, experienced their mother's absence as a story rather than a wound. And Clara herself, what was her loss precisely? Not family, for the Harmons had never provided the love and security that defined true kinship. Not physical beauty, for even before the fire she had been an ordinary child, neither plain nor pretty. Perhaps what she had lost was potential, the opportunity to discover who she might have become without the distorting lens of tragedy. Dawn light began filtering through the window, illuminating the sleeping children with gentle radiance. Clara rose quietly and returned to her room, adjusting her mask before the household stirred to life. Later that morning, as Clara kneaded bread dough with practiced movements, Thomas paused beside her on his way to the barn. "Jackson seems well rested today," he observed casually. No circles beneath his eyes. Clara continued working the dough, understanding the unspoken question. "He had a dream about Catherine. We talked until he fell asleep again." Thomas nodded once. "Thank you." Two simple words, yet Clara heard depths beneath them. Gratitude not just for comfort provided to his son, but for the sharing of emotional burden Thomas himself found difficult to address. "He remembers her with love," Clara said softly. "That is a gift, not a sorrow." Thomas's expression remained neutral, but something in his posture shifted, tension easing from his shoulders. "Yes, it is." The moment stretched between them, unexpectedly intimate despite the physical distance Thomas maintained. Then he turned and continued to the barn, but Clara sensed a subtle change in their dynamic. A layer of reserve had dissolved, leaving greater understanding in its wake. The next day brought scorching heat, the kind that shimmers above the earth in visible waves. Clara modified the household routine accordingly, completing essential outdoor tasks in early morning and arranging quiet indoor activities for the children during the most punishing hours. By mid-afternoon, even the house offered little respite, its wooden walls absorbing the sun's relentless attention. Clara dampened cloths with precious water from the rain barrel, showing the twins how to press them against pulse points for relief. "Father takes us swimming when it gets this hot," Ruth informed her, face flushed despite the damp cloth at her neck. "In the deep pool where the creek bends." Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "With the big rocks for jumping." Clara glanced out the window to where Thomas and Jackson repaired a wagon wheel in the partial shade of the barn overhang. Both worked stripped to the waist, skin glistening with sweat despite the inadequate shelter. "Perhaps your father will take you later when the worst heat passes," Clara suggested, knowing how precious water remained even with the reliable creek. She had learned that Thomas stockpiled supplies with military precision, always planning for potential drought or disaster. The twins exchanged meaningful glances, communicating in that mysterious language shared by identical siblings. Ruth, typically the spokesperson, cleared her throat with exaggerated importance. "You could take us," she proposed. "Father says you're in charge when he's busy." Clara hesitated. The creek lay within sight of the house, but venturing beyond the immediate yard would mean greater exposure. Not to danger, Thomas would never allow his daughters near the water without proven safety, but to the elements, to potential observation, to the world she had hidden from for 15 years. Rebecca sensed her hesitation. "We won't look at your face," she promised earnestly. "We'll close our eyes if you want to swim too." The innocent offer nearly undid Clara's composure. These children, uncontaminated by the prejudice and cruelty of adults, saw her mask as a simple preference rather than a necessary shield. "Let me speak with your father," Clara said finally. Thomas looked up from the wagon wheel as Clara approached, wiping his brow with a forearm already coated with dust and sweat. Jackson continued working, small hands competently managing tools sized for a grown man. "The twins are suffering in the heat," Clara explained. "They mentioned a swimming place in the creek." Thomas straightened, assessing the merciless sun beating down on the ranch. "The deep pool past the willow bend," he confirmed. "Safe enough with supervision. Jackson and I will join you when we finish here." Clara nodded, turning back toward the house, but Thomas's voice stopped her. "Clara." She turned, noting his use of her name rather than the more formal Miss he typically employed. "The path to the pool is private. No travelers pass that way." His eyes held steady on the eye holes of her mask. "You need not concern yourself with observation." Clara understood his meaning immediately. He was offering her freedom from scrutiny, the opportunity to cool herself in the water without fear of judgment or exposure. The consideration behind this simple statement affected her more deeply than any grand gesture could have. "Thank you," she said simply. The creek pool proved to be a natural oasis, shaded by ancient willows and bordered by smooth stones perfect for small feet. Clara supervised the twins with careful attention, keeping them in the shallower areas while they splashed and giggled with unrestrained joy. True to their promise, they kept their eyes averted when Clara settled on a flat rock and lifted her mask just enough to feel the blessed relief of cooler air against her scarred skin. Not complete removal, she wasn't ready for that, but enough to experience momentary liberation. Thomas and Jackson arrived as the sun began its westward descent, the worst heat dissipating with the approaching evening. Thomas checked the surroundings with habitual vigilance before allowing Jackson to join his sisters in the water. "The wheel is repaired," he reported, settling on a rock near Clara, but not crowding her space. "Should hold through harvest season." Clara nodded, watching the children's water games with contented attention. "They swim well for their ages." Catherine insisted, Thomas explained, rare mention of his wife coming naturally in this moment. Said any child raised near water should master it early. Clara heard the pride beneath his matter-of-fact tone. She was right. Thomas studied the playing children, his expression softening in a way Clara had observed only in unguarded moments. She was right about many things. The simple admission revealed more about Thomas Blackwell than hours of conversation might have. A man capable of acknowledging his wife's wisdom, of carrying her influence forward in raising their children. This spoke to character deeper than the physical courage he had demonstrated in the town square. They sat in companionable silence as the children's energy gradually waned, water play becoming more subdued as muscles tired and hunger began asserting itself. "Jackson mentioned you talked with him," Thomas said finally, voice low to prevent carrying to the children. "About Catherine." Clara nodded, unsure whether she had overstepped some boundary. He needed to speak of her, to share his memories. Thomas picked up a small stone, turning it over in scarred fingers. "I have found it difficult to discuss Catherine with the children. Selfish, perhaps." "Not selfish," Clara corrected gently. "Self-preserving. Some wounds require time before they can bear exposure." Thomas glanced at her, understanding passing between them without explicit acknowledgement of the parallels to her own concealment. "Nevertheless," he continued, "I am grateful for your willingness to listen where I have failed." "Not failed," Clara said firmly, "simply healing at your own pace." Thomas considered her words, then nodded once, acceptance rather than agreement. He stood, calling to the children that supper would be waiting. As they walked back to the house, the twins skipping ahead while Jackson detailed his repair work to Clara with serious precision, Thomas maintained a protective position at the rear of their small procession. Clara sensed rather than saw his continued vigilance, the cavalry officer's instinct to secure both advance and retreat. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat on the porch steps, savoring the relatively cooler air of evening. The day's heat lingered in the wooden planks beneath her, but a gentle breeze carried promise of eventual relief. The door opened behind her, Thomas's distinctive tread identifying him before he spoke. He carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one silently as he settled beside her, careful to maintain the respectful distance he always observed. "The children sleep deeply after swimming," he observed. "A blessing on nights like these." Clara nodded, adjusting her mask slightly to sip the coffee. The beverage's warmth seemed counterintuitive in the lingering heat, yet somehow appropriate to the moment. "I have been considering Josiah's warning," Thomas continued, "and the broader implications." Clara turned toward him, attentive. In the days since the old cavalryman's visit, Thomas had maintained his usual routine while subtly increasing security measures around the property. "The railroad survey follows the creek line through my property," he explained. "Providing water access for steam engines at regular intervals is essential to their planned route." "Could they not simply purchase water rights from you?" Clara asked. "Surely that would be simpler than whatever they might be planning." Thomas's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "Simpler, yes, but more expensive. My deed includes exclusive water rights to 10 miles of creek flow. The territorial government would have to honor those rights unless your claim could be invalidated," Clara finished, understanding dawning. And a woman claimed as mentally incompetent residing on your property provides a convenient pretext. Thomas nodded grimly. Frontier law remains flexible where powerful interests are concerned. Your parents' claims, backed by a corrupt sheriff and railroad money, could create complications at minimum. Clara absorbed this information, connecting it to larger patterns she had observed throughout her life. My presence endangers your children's inheritance. No, Thomas said firmly. The greed of men who would use you as a pawn endangers what is rightfully ours. There is a significant difference. The distinction mattered to him, Clara realized. Thomas Blackwell operated according to a moral code that transcended simple pragmatism. He would not abandon a principle merely because maintaining it became difficult. What will you do? She asked finally. Thomas sipped his coffee, eyes scanning the darkened landscape with habitual vigilance. Josiah's advice was sound. Judge Wilson and Prescott could provide legal reinforcement for my claim. He paused. But traveling to Prescott would mean leaving the ranch vulnerable for at least a week. The implications hung between them. Thomas would not leave his children unprotected, yet remaining meant postponing a potential solution. I could accompany the children to the Turner farm while you travel, Clara suggested. Safety in numbers. Thomas shook his head. The Turners are good people, but elderly. If trouble came, they could offer little resistance. He set his empty cup aside. No, another solution must be found. They sat in thoughtful silence, the night sounds of the territory providing subtle accompaniment to their contemplation. Coyotes called in the distance. An owl hooted from the barn rafters. The creek murmured its endless journey beyond the house. There is another possibility, Clara said slowly, an idea taking shape in her mind, one that addresses multiple concerns simultaneously. Thomas turned toward her, attentive. I'm listening. If I were to establish legal independence from my parents, she began carefully, their claims regarding my competence would hold no weight. Their leverage against your property would diminish significantly. True, Thomas agreed, but establishing such independence would require legal proceedings, witnesses, evidence. His voice gentled. Visibility. The word landed between them with all its implicit challenge. Clara touched the edge of her mask reflexively, 15 years of hiding creating instinctive resistance to the very concept. Yes, she acknowledged, I would need to show my face to a judge, at minimum, possibly to a courtroom. She drew a steadying breath. But if doing so protects this home, your children's future, then the discomfort becomes worthwhile. Thomas studied her for a long moment, the moonlight illuminating his weathered features. I would not ask such sacrifice of you. You have not asked, Clara pointed out. I am offering. There is a difference. A smile touched the corners of Thomas's mouth. Recognition of his own words reflected back to him. Indeed there is. Clara straightened her shoulders. If establishing my legal independence can protect your children's future, then the journey is necessary, regardless of personal discomfort. Thomas studied her thoughtfully. You understand this would require revealing your face to the judge, at minimum. Yes. She touched her mask briefly. 15 years of hiding has not made the prospect easier. But perhaps it is time. A steadying breath. What matters is the outcome, not the momentary vulnerability. Thomas nodded, respect evident in his expression. I will make arrangements. We could depart in 3 days' time, after proper preparation. That night, Clara sat by her window long after the household had settled into sleep. The decision to journey to Prescott represented more than physical travel. It was a deliberate step toward a self-determined future. For the first time in 15 years, she was choosing exposure rather than concealment, not because safety demanded it, but because justice required it. The following days passed in focused preparation. Thomas arranged for the children to stay with the Turners while they traveled, and for his trusted ranch hand Jenkins to maintain security in their absence. Clara altered a riding skirt from Catherine's clothing, preparing for the practical demands of the journey while silently bracing for its emotional challenges. On the second evening, Thomas found Clara on the porch after the children were asleep, a restlessness about her that spoke of pre-journey anxiety. Courage is not the absence of fear, he said quietly, joining her. It is action in the face of fear. Clara nodded, understanding that he spoke from experience. How many battlefield charges had Captain Thomas Blackwell led while terror coursed through his veins? How many impossible decisions had he made while death reigned around him? I learned long ago that waiting for fear to subside merely prolongs its power, she responded. Better to acknowledge its presence and proceed nonetheless. Thomas regarded her with quiet appreciation. Catherine would have liked you, he said simply. The unexpected compliment affected Clara more deeply than flowery praise might have. To be compared favorably to the woman Thomas had loved, the mother of his children, the partner whose loss clearly still resonated through his life, this represented acceptance of the highest order. I believe I would have liked her as well, Clara replied. As they prepared to return inside, a flicker of movement at the property's edge caught Thomas's attention. He stiffened, hand moving instinctively toward the revolver he wore even within his own home. Inside, he instructed, voice dropping to the commanding tone Clara imagined had directed men through battle. Bar the door. Clara obeyed without question, understanding that Thomas's vigilance had proven necessary rather than excessive. She secured the door as instructed, then moved quietly to the children's room, where all three slept peacefully, unaware of potential threat. Through the window, she observed Thomas moving toward the barn with the practiced stealth of a cavalry scout, utilizing shadows and minimal movement to avoid detection. The barn door opened just enough to admit his frame, then closed silently behind him. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Clara positioned herself where she could monitor both the children and the yard outside, the revolver from beneath the floorboard now in her hand. Thomas had shown her its proper handling during their planning discussions, respecting her intelligence enough to provide instruction rather than platitudes about women's capabilities. A whistle pierced the night, 3 short notes in a specific pattern. Thomas's all-clear signal. Clara exhaled slowly, muscles relaxing from tension she hadn't fully acknowledged. When Thomas returned to the house, his expression revealed both relief and concern. A drifter, he explained quietly, looking for an easy target. He reconsidered when he saw the rifle barrel through the barn window. Clara nodded, returning the revolver to its hiding place. The children slept through it all. Good. Thomas checked each room methodically before seeming to fully relax. We should rest. Tomorrow begins preparations for our journey. As Clara prepared for sleep that night, she found herself reflecting on how quickly her world had transformed. 2 weeks ago, she had stood chained in the town square, a spectacle of misfortune displayed for public consumption. Now she prepared to travel to the territorial capital, to stand before a judge not as victim, but as advocate for both her own freedom and the security of this makeshift family that had unexpectedly embraced her. The journey would require courage beyond anything she had needed while simply enduring captivity. Passivity demanded its own strength, but action required different resources altogether. As she adjusted her mask for sleep, Clara wondered what her face would reveal when finally exposed to daylight after so many years of concealment. Not just the physical scars, whose topography she knew by touch alone, but the person beneath them. The woman who had survived, learned, adapted, and now chose to emerge. Perhaps Thomas was right. Courage was not the absence of fear, but action despite its presence. By that measure, the journey to Prescott might prove the most courageous act of her life. Dawn broke over the Blackwell Ranch with the soft, golden promise of early autumn. The scorching heat of summer had begun its gradual retreat, leaving mornings crisp and afternoons bearable. Perfect weather for the journey to Prescott, though Thomas noted the gathering clouds on the western horizon with a cavalry officer's weather-trained eye. Rain within 2 days, he predicted, securing the last of their provisions into saddlebags. We should reach Prescott before the worst arrives. Clara nodded, adjusting her mask carefully beneath the wide-brimmed hat Thomas had provided. Additional protection from curious eyes during their journey, he'd explained, though both understood the hat's practicality could not eliminate the fundamental challenge ahead. Jackson stood solemnly beside the loaded horses, his small face composed with effort. At 6, he understood responsibility too well for his age, the legacy of losing a mother and witnessing his father's struggle to maintain their world afterward. Remember what I told you, Thomas said, kneeling to eye level with his son. Mr. Turner will oversee the ranch, but you are to watch over your sisters. Keep them close. Maintain the routine. Yes, sir, Jackson replied, shoulders square beneath the weight of expectation. 2 days at the Turners, then back home with Mr. Jenkins checking on us morning and night until you return. Thomas clasped his son's shoulder, a gesture more eloquent than words between males of the Blackwell line. You'll do fine, son. The twins clung to Clara's skirts, their earlier excitement about staying with the Turner family temporarily overshadowed by the reality of separation. Rebecca's lower lip trembled suspiciously, while Ruth maintained a stoic facade that mirrored her father's. Clara knelt awkwardly, the unfamiliar riding skirt restricting her movement. We will return before you've had time to miss us, she promised, gathering both girls into a gentle embrace. The casual physical affection still felt foreign after 15 years of isolation, yet the children's unquestioning acceptance made each touch easier than the last. But we already miss you, Rebecca protested, small fingers clutching the fabric of Clara's sleeve. Then think of all the stories you'll have to tell us when we return, Clara suggested. Adventures with the Turner grandchildren, new eggs from the chickens, perhaps even the creek rising with rain. This perspective shift worked its predictable magic, the twins' imagination immediately constructing potential tales of domestic adventure. By the time Thomas helped Clara mount the sturdy mare selected for her use, the children were engaged in debate about whether rain might bring frogs to the creek banks. The Turners had arrived earlier to transport the children to their farm. Elderly but kind faces creased with the genuine affection they held for the Blackwell family. Mrs. Turner assured Clara that the children would be lovingly supervised, while Mr. Turner engaged in low-voiced conversation with Thomas about security arrangements during his absence. Jenkins will patrol the boundaries daily, Thomas instructed, referencing his most trusted ranch hand who would remain behind. Any strangers approach, fire 3 shots. The militia veterans in the valley will respond. Mr. Turner nodded gravely. The territorial settlements might lack formal military structure, but the veterans of America's bloodiest conflict maintain their own communication systems and response protocols. An attack on one homestead would mobilize a dozen combat-experienced men within an hour. As they prepared to depart, Thomas approached Clara's horse, adjusting the stirrup leather with practiced hands. 3 days to Prescott, he said quietly. 2 days of legal proceedings if all goes well. 3 days return journey, just over a week away from the children. Clara heard the unspoken question beneath his factual assessment. They will be well cared for, she assured him, and our journey serves their long-term security. Thomas nodded once, accepting her perspective without further comment. He mounted the Appaloosa with the fluid grace of a man who had spent half his life on horseback, settling into the saddle with unconscious authority. With final waves to the children and their caretakers, they turned their horses toward the eastern trail that would eventually connect with the main road to Prescott. Clara felt the weight of multiple gazes on her back, the children watching their father and their unexpected guardian depart, the Turners observing with the wisdom of those who had weathered many separations, and Thomas himself, whose awareness seemed to encompass all aspects of their situation simultaneously. The first few miles passed in comfortable silence, each rider adjusting to the rhythm of their mount and the reality of the journey ahead. Clara had not ridden since childhood, but her body remembered the basic mechanics despite years of enforced stillness. Thomas set a pace that allowed her to acclimate gradually, neither rushing nor patronizing her developing skill. By mid-morning, they had left the immediate environs of the ranch and entered territory Clara had never seen. The landscape opened into rolling grasslands dotted with mesquite and occasional stands of cottonwood, marking underground water sources. In the distance, mountains rose in purple majesty, their jagged profiles promising challenges yet to come. Difficult terrain between here and Prescott, Thomas commented, breaking the companionable silence. Apache country historically, though most bands have accepted reservation life now. Clara absorbed this information with the same practical attention she applied to all aspects of her new existence. You anticipate potential danger? Thomas's mouth quirked slightly. I anticipate everything. Habit formed during the war. Most dangers never materialize, but preparation prevents disaster when they do. Clara nodded, understanding his perspective perfectly. Her own hypervigilance, developed through years of anticipating her parents' cruelty, created similar instincts, though different in application. "The judge we seek," she said, changing the subject. "You trust him?" Thomas considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. James Wilson was a fair commander. Demanded much, but never more than a man could give. After the war, he studied law in Chicago before accepting the territorial appointment. He adjusted his hat against the strengthening sun. He values justice above convenience, which makes him unusual among frontier officials. "And he owes you a favor," Clara recalled from Josiah Parker's message. A shadow crossed Thomas's face, memory darkening his features momentarily. At Gettysburg, Wilson's horse was shot from under him during a Confederate artillery barrage. Pinned him beneath the carcass in direct line of fire. I helped extract him. The deliberately neutral tone suggested details left unspoken. He credits me with saving his life. Clara absorbed this information, adding another piece to the complex puzzle that formed Thomas Blackwell. A man who had charged into artillery fire to save his commanding officer, yet spoke of the act as simply a duty fulfilled rather than exceptional courage. They stopped briefly at midday, resting the horses in the shade of a massive cottonwood grove beside a small spring. Thomas prepared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, supplemented with dried apples, moving with the efficient precision of a man accustomed to trail living. As they ate, Clara found herself studying Thomas when his attention focused elsewhere. The lines etched around his eyes spoke of squinting into both sunlight and gunfire. The permanent vigilance in his posture revealed a man who had learned through brutal experience that relaxation could equal death. Yet beneath these martial characteristics lay gentleness evidenced in his treatment of children, animals, and Clara herself. "You're wondering about the war," Thomas observed without looking up from adjusting his saddle girth. Clara startled slightly, unaccustomed to having her thoughts so accurately perceived. "Is it that obvious?" "Most people do," he replied matter-of-factly. "Civilians see the uniform or hear cavalry officer and immediately construct narratives of glory or savagery, depending on their politics." He checked the horizon before continuing. The reality was mostly mud, hunger, and waiting, punctuated by moments of absolute terror. "And after?" Clara asked quietly. "When you returned home?" Thomas secured the saddle with practiced hands. "There was no home. My parents' farm in Pennsylvania had been sold to cover debts. No family remained. The army had been my home for years, but peacetime cavalry held little appeal." He straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "So I came west with my discharge, pay, and land grant. Met Catherine in Santa Fe where she was teaching school. The rest followed naturally." The simple narrative contained volumes between its sparse sentences. Loss, adaptation, new beginnings. Themes Clara understood intimately, though their circumstances differed dramatically. "And now?" she prompted gently. Thomas's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Now I build something worth leaving to my children. Something that can't be taken by war or politics or railroad interests." The determination in his voice resonated with Clara's emerging sense of self. Both sought to create futures unbound by tragic pasts, though through different means. They continued their journey through afternoon heat that intensified despite the advancing season. The trail climbed gradually, mesquite giving way to juniper and pine as elevation increased. Thomas pointed out landmarks and trail signs with the expertise of a man who had mapped this territory both mentally and on paper. By late afternoon, they approached a small way station, little more than a crude cabin with attached corral where travelers could rest safely before continuing to Prescott. The establishment's owner, a grizzled former prospector named Simmons, greeted Thomas with the respect reserved for reliable customers and good men. "Captain Blackwell," he acknowledged, roomy eyes taking in Clara's masked presence without visible reaction. "Room's ready, fresh straw in the lean-to for sleeping, creeks running clear for horses." Thomas dismounted, assisting Clara with practiced courtesy. "Much obliged, Simmons. Any other travelers tonight?" The old man spat a stream of tobacco juice that narrowly missed the captain's boot. "Couple fellows passed through yesterday. Railroad surveyors by their instruments. Asked about water rights along Thompson Creek." His gaze sharpened beneath bushy eyebrows. "Seemed mighty interested in your section when I mentioned your name." Thomas absorbed this information with outward calm, though Clara detected the subtle tension that straightened his spine. "Appreciate the warning." Simmons nodded toward the lean-to attached to the main cabin. "Put you in the back room, more private." His eyes flicked briefly to Clara's masked face, then away without comment. "Stew's on. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill the hollow spots." As they settled their horses and belongings, Clara noted Thomas's increased vigilance, his awareness expanding to encompass every aspect of their surroundings. The easy rhythm of their daytime travel had shifted into something more tactical, reminding her of his military background. "Railroad interests move quickly," he observed quietly as they washed trail dust from hands and faces at the outdoor basin. "We were right to undertake this journey now, rather than later." Clara nodded, carefully maintaining her mask despite the discomfort of heat and dust accumulated beneath it. "Will we reach Prescott tomorrow?" "By afternoon if we start at first light," Thomas confirmed. "Judge Wilson keeps chambers until sunset. We should be able to present our case immediately." The way station's accommodations proved simple but clean, the back room offering privacy with its single window and sturdy door. Thomas insisted Clara take the room's narrow cot while he would spread his bedroll in the main cabin with other travelers. The arrangement reflected his unfailing propriety, maintaining both Clara's safety and reputation with equal concern. Simmons's stew fulfilled its promise of satisfying hunger, if not culinary ambition. The tough beef and root vegetables softened by hours of slow cooking. They ate at the crude common table, Clara lifting the bottom edge of her mask just enough to allow food entry, a practice she had perfected at the Blackwell Ranch. Other travelers, a freight driver and two prospectors, maintained the frontier courtesy of avoiding direct stares at Clara's covered face, though their curiosity manifested in sidelong glances, quickly averted when Thomas's level gaze met theirs. Conversation remained general. Weather predictions, road conditions, rumors of Apache movements near the Mexican border. After the meal, Clara retired to the small room, grateful for moments of solitude after a day of constant companionship. She removed her mask cautiously, mindful of the window despite its covering of oiled paper rather than glass. The relief of cool air against her scarred skin felt almost decadent after hours of confinement. Using precious water from the pitcher Simmons had provided, Clara washed her face with careful attention, reacquainting herself with features known only by touch for 15 years. The mirror she deliberately avoided, not yet prepared for that particular confrontation with reality. A soft knock at the door announced Thomas's presence. "All secure," he reported through the closed door. "I'll be just outside if needed." "Thank you," Clara replied, appreciating both his vigilance and his respect for her privacy. She slept fitfully despite physical exhaustion, her dreams populated by faceless judges and crowded courtrooms where her mask dissolved like mist, leaving her exposed to countless staring eyes. Each time she woke, the solid presence of Thomas sleeping against her door provided reassurance that transcended mere physical protection. Dawn arrived with the promise of approaching weather, clouds building on the western horizon as Thomas had predicted. They departed the way station early, Simmons providing fresh biscuits and coffee to fortify them for the journey ahead. The old man's parting words suggested broader support than Clara had anticipated. "Judge Wilson's a good man," he told Thomas as they mounted. "Fair-minded. Don't cotton to railroad bullies pushing folks around." His gaze included Clara with surprising directness. "Ma'am, there's those of us out here who judge folks by what they do, not how they look. Remember that when doubts come." The simple wisdom sustained Clara as they traveled the increasingly rugged trail toward Prescott. The terrain grew more challenging, requiring complete concentration on riding safely through narrow passes and across rushing streams swollen by distant rainfall. By mid-afternoon, the territorial capital appeared in the valley below their elevated trail. Prescott presented a striking contrast to Dry Gulch's humble collection of buildings. Streets laid in orderly grids contained substantial structures of wood and stone. The territorial government buildings dominated the town center, their white-painted facades and columned porches suggesting Eastern architectural aspirations transplanted to frontier soil. Thomas guided them along side streets, avoiding the busier thoroughfares where Clara's masked appearance might attract unwanted attention. They stopped at a modest boarding house on the town's eastern edge, its weathered sign advertising clean rooms for respectable guests. The proprietress, a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Abernathy, greeted Thomas with the familiarity of previous acquaintance. "Captain Blackwell," she acknowledged, "your usual room is available." Her gaze assessed Clara with professional discretion. And a connecting room for the lady, I presume? Please, Thomas confirmed, completing the transaction with minimal conversation. No explanation of Clara's masked face was offered or requested, the frontier code of minding one's business operating to their advantage. Once settled in their adjoining rooms, connected by a door kept slightly ajar for propriety combined with protection, Thomas outlined their strategy for the coming day. Judge Wilson holds court in the territorial building from 9 until noon, then private chambers until sunset, he explained, voice pitched low to prevent carrying beyond their rooms. We'll approach during private chambers tomorrow afternoon. Less public exposure. Clara nodded, anxiety and determination warring beneath her outwardly calm demeanor. What should I expect? Thomas considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. The judge will require your testimony regarding your parents' treatment and your current mental competence. He may ask to see, he hesitated. My face, Clara completed evenly. Yes, I assumed as much. Only the judge, Thomas assured her. No spectators or court officials. I've arranged for private chambers. The consideration behind this arrangement touched Clara deeply. Thomas had anticipated her greatest fear, public exposure, and structured their approach to minimize that particular ordeal. And your water rights? She asked, redirecting the conversation away from her own challenges. Secondary to establishing your legal independence, Thomas replied firmly. Once you're recognized as a competent adult free from parental authority, their potential claim against my property becomes invalid. The water rights will follow naturally. Clara absorbed this perspective with growing appreciation for Thomas's principled approach. He consistently prioritized her welfare above even his children's inheritance, a moral stance at odds with typical frontier pragmatism. Rest tonight, Thomas advised, preparing to return to his own room. Tomorrow requires strength of different kinds than physical endurance. Left alone, Clara moved to the room's small window, gazing out at Prescott's orderly streets now illuminated by lamplight as evening descended. After years of isolation and weeks of rural seclusion, the modest territorial capital seemed overwhelmingly civilized and populous. Somewhere in those streets walked men and women going about their business without thought for her predicament. Shopkeepers closing for the night. Government officials returning to families. Ordinary citizens whose faces remained uncovered, unremarked, simply accepted as the physical manifestation of their personhood. Tomorrow she would take her first steps toward joining their ranks, not physically perhaps, as her scarred appearance would always mark her as different, but legally, a citizen with rights rather than property to be claimed and controlled. The magnitude of this transition settled over Clara with the weight of approaching storm clouds. For 15 years, she had survived through invisibility, existing in shadows where judgment could not reach. Tomorrow would require the opposite strategy, visibility, testimony, presenting herself for official evaluation and recognition. She slept little that night despite the relative comfort of Mrs. Abernathy's clean bedding and quiet establishment. Each time consciousness drifted toward sleep, her mind conjured new scenarios of potential humiliation or failure. Each time she woke, the steady sound of Thomas's breathing through the partially open connecting door reminded her that she did not face the challenge alone. Morning arrived with rain, gentle but persistent, transforming Prescott's dusty streets into channels of red-brown mud. Thomas procured breakfast from a nearby bakery, allowing Clara to eat in the privacy of her room rather than facing the boarding house's common table. Judge Wilson will see us at 2 o'clock, he reported, having already ventured to the territorial offices while Clara prepared for the day. Private chambers as requested. Clara nodded, fingers automatically checking the security of her mask, despite the coming necessity of its removal. Have you told him why we come? Only that it concerns legal independence for a ward under inappropriate control and water rights potentially impacted by railroad interests, Thomas replied. He understands the confidential nature of our petition. The hours until their appointment stretched interminably, each minute simultaneously too brief for adequate preparation and too long for sustained courage. Clara alternated between pacing the small confines of her room and sitting motionless beside the rain-streaked window, mentally rehearsing her testimony. At precisely 1:30, Thomas knocked gently on the connecting door. Time to depart if we're to arrive punctually, he said, his voice conveying calm confidence rather than the concern Clara suspected he must feel. They traversed Prescott's muddy streets beneath the shelter of a large umbrella Thomas had procured, her wide-brimmed hat providing additional protection from both elements and curious eyes. Few pedestrians braved the persistent rainfall, allowing them to reach the territorial building with minimal observation. The government structure's interior presented unexpected grandeur for a frontier outpost. Polished wooden floors gleamed beneath the light of oil lamps made necessary by the storm's gloom. Official portraits lined walls of actual plaster rather than rough-hewn logs. The scent of beeswax and leather created an atmosphere of authority and permanence. Thomas navigated the corridors with confidence born of previous visits, leading Clara to a less-traveled hallway where a single door bore the simple designation, Judge James Wilson, Territorial Circuit Court. Before knocking, Thomas turned to Clara, his expression solemn. Whatever happens within, remember that your worth is not determined by one man's judgment, however fair he may be. The simple affirmation steadied Clara more effectively than elaborate reassurances might have. She nodded once, squaring her shoulders beneath the damp wool of her traveling coat. Thomas's knock produced an immediate response. "Enter," called a voice accustomed to command. The judge's chambers contained neither the opulence Clara had feared nor the frontier crudeness she had half expected. Substantial bookshelves lined walls painted a dignified green. A massive desk of dark wood dominated the room's center, behind which sat a man whose bearing identified him as former military even before introductions confirmed it. Judge James Wilson rose as they entered, extending his hand first to Thomas. "Captain Blackwell," he greeted, genuine warmth evident beneath official decorum. "It's been too long." "Judge Wilson," Thomas responded, the handshake between them conveying shared history beyond their current roles. "Thank you for seeing us on short notice." The judge turned toward Clara, his expression revealing neither shock nor pity at her masked appearance. "Ma'am," he acknowledged with a respectful nod, correctly intuiting that she might not welcome physical contact from a stranger. "Please be seated," Wilson continued, indicating comfortable chairs positioned before his desk. "Captain Blackwell indicates your matter requires both discretion and judicial authority." Clara sat with careful composure, hands folded in her lap to disguise their slight trembling. Thomas remained standing until she was settled, then took the adjacent chair with military erectness. "Judge Wilson," Thomas began, "may I present Miss Clara Harmon, formerly of Dry Gulch. Miss Harmon seeks legal declaration of independence from parental authority in recognition as a competent adult capable of determining her own residence and associations." The judge's expression remained neutral as he retrieved a leather-bound notebook and fountain pen from his desk drawer. "I see. And the circumstances necessitating such declaration?" Thomas glanced at Clara, silently deferring to her readiness to speak for herself. She drew a steady breath, marshaling courage cultivated through 15 years of endurance. "Your Honor," she began, voice emerging stronger than anticipated. "For 15 years I have been kept in effective imprisonment by Walter and Eleanor Harmon of Dry Gulch. Following an accident in childhood that left me with significant facial scarring, they deemed me unfit for public view, and consequently denied me freedom of movement, education, or association." Judge Wilson made brief notations without interrupting her narrative. His expression remained professionally neutral, though Clara detected the subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested controlled anger at her treatment. "When I reached adulthood at 20 years of age, they continued this confinement, eventually exhibiting me publicly in the Dry Gulch Market Square as a curiosity, chained and masked against my will. It was there that Captain Blackwell intervened, offering sanctuary at his ranch where I have resided for the past month." The judge looked up from his notes. "Captain Blackwell's intervention was based on humanitarian grounds, I presume?" "Solely such grounds," Thomas confirmed. "Miss Harmon has since proven herself an invaluable assistance with my children and household, demonstrating both mental competence and practical capability beyond question." Wilson made another notation before addressing Clara directly. "Miss Harmon, I must ask a difficult question. Your parents' treatment suggests they consider you mentally incompetent. Is there any medical or psychological basis for such a determination?" Clara's spine straightened imperceptibly. "None whatsoever, Your Honor. My injuries were entirely physical, resulting from a kerosene lamp explosion when I was 5 years old. My mental faculties remained unaffected, though my education was severely limited by subsequent confinement. Yet you speak with obvious education and vocabulary beyond common frontier usage, the judge observed. I learned to read before my accident, Claire explained. Afterward, I continued self-education through whatever books came into the household, often reading them secretly through doors left ajar or windows. I listened to conversations, lessons given to other children, discussions between my parents and visitors. Learning became my only freedom. Judge Wilson considered this information thoughtfully. A testament to human resilience and determination, he commented, setting aside his pen. Miss Harmon, I must now ask something more difficult still. To make a fully informed judgment regarding your petition, I need to assess the nature of your injuries that precipitated such extraordinary treatment. Clara nodded, having anticipated this requirement despite Thomas's protective arrangements. I understand, Your Honor. The judge glanced toward Thomas. Captain, if you would prefer to step outside during this portion, I would prefer to remain if Miss Harmon permits it, Thomas interjected quietly, as her advocate and witness to her competence. Clara felt unexpected gratitude for his request. Thomas had never seen her uncovered face in full light, yet his desire to remain suggested support that transcended physical appearance. You may stay, she confirmed, fingers moving toward the secure knot that held her mask in place. For 15 years, this moment had represented her greatest fear, deliberate unveiling before judging eyes. Now, paradoxically, it represented potential liberation. With steady hands that belied her internal turmoil, Clara untied the burlap covering and lowered it from her face. The judge's expression remained admirably controlled, though Clara detected the momentary widening of eyes that constituted his only visible reaction. Beside her, Thomas maintained respectful attention without flinching or averting his gaze. The right side remained unaffected, Clara explained unnecessarily, conscious of the stark contrast between her unmarred right profile and the extensive scarring that distorted the left side of her face from temple to jawline. The burns healed as well as could be expected without proper medical attention. Judge Wilson nodded gravely. Thank you, Miss Harmon. Your willingness to share something so personal speaks to your courage and determination to secure legal recognition. Clara replaced her mask with the same deliberate movements, the familiar rough fabric settling against her skin with the paradoxical comfort of long association. Though temporary protection rather than permanent concealment, the mask allowed her to regain emotional equilibrium after the vulnerability of exposure. Having examined the physical evidence and heard testimony regarding your circumstances, the judge continued, I find no impediment to granting legal recognition of your independent adult status. He retrieved his pen and opened an official document bearing the territorial seal. I hereby declare you, Clara Harmon, age 21, to be a free and competent adult with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto, including determination of residence, association, and self-governance. The formal language washed over Clara like rainfall on parched earth. 21. The judge had granted her an additional year beyond her actual age, a small kindness that provided extra insulation against parental claims. Furthermore, Wilson continued, still writing with practiced precision, I find the treatment you endured constitutes unlawful imprisonment and potential criminal misconduct. Should you wish to pursue charges against Walter and Eleanor Harmon, this court would entertain such action. Clara considered this unexpected option, weighing justice against her desire to move forward unencumbered by further engagement with her past. I seek freedom rather than retribution, Your Honor. The legal declaration of independence satisfies my primary concern. The judge nodded, respect evident in his expression. A generous position that speaks well of your character, Miss Harmon. He turned to Thomas. Now, Captain Blackwell, I understand there is a related matter regarding water rights potentially impacted by Miss Harmon's situation. Thomas explained concisely the territorial water rights attached to his property deed, the railroad's interest in the same resources, and the potential strategy of using Clara's presence to challenge his claim through her parents. Judge Wilson listened attentively, making occasional notations. When Thomas finished, the judge reviewed several documents from his desk drawer before responding. Having examined the territorial land records for your property, Captain, I find your water rights legally secured through proper filing and continuous beneficial use. Combined with today's declaration regarding Ms. Harmon's independent status, I see no legitimate avenue for challenge by either the Harmons or railroad interests operating through them. He completed his writing with a decisive flourish, then applied the official seal to both documents. Ms. Harmon's Declaration of Independence and clarification of your water rights are hereby entered into territorial records. Any party wishing to contest either determination must present compelling evidence before this court, not through extrajudicial means or harassment. The comprehensive resolution exceeded Clara's most optimistic expectations. Not only had she secured legal recognition of her independence, but Thomas's property rights had received additional protection through official judicial clarification. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, the simple phrase inadequate to express her profound gratitude. Judge Wilson smiled slightly, humanity briefly superseding judicial formality. "Justice requires neither thanks nor gratitude, Miss Harmon, merely the opportunity to be properly administered." He turned to Thomas. "Captain Blackwell, I remain in your debt for services rendered at Gettysburg. Consider today partial repayment of an obligation that can never be fully discharged." The men exchanged a look that communicated shared experiences beyond civilian understanding. Then the judge handed copies of both official documents to Thomas for safekeeping. "I would recommend returning to your property expeditiously," Wilson advised as they prepared to depart. "Railroad interests have demonstrated increasing aggression throughout the territory. Legal protection is optimal when reinforced by physical presence." Outside the territorial building, rain continued falling steadily, matching the rhythm of Clara's racing thoughts. Legal independence after 15 years of effective imprisonment, official recognition of personhood and competence, the right to determine her own future without parental interference or control. "We should return to Mrs. Abernathy's to collect our belongings," Thomas suggested as they navigated Prescott's muddy streets. "If we depart immediately, we can reach the way station before full dark." Clara nodded agreement, practical considerations temporarily displacing the emotional magnitude of the afternoon's events. The weather favors swift travel despite the discomfort. Thomas studied her with perceptive attention. "You conducted yourself with remarkable composure, Clara. Few who have not faced battlefield conditions demonstrate such courage under pressure." The comparison coming from a decorated cavalry officer affected Clara deeply. "Different battles require different forms of courage," she responded. "Yours involved facing enemy fire. Mine merely required facing truth long concealed." "Nothing mere about that particular truth," Thomas observed quietly. "More about the strength required to reveal it." They collected their few belongings from the boarding house, settled accounts with Mrs. Abernathy, and prepared the horses for immediate departure despite the continuing rainfall. Clara found herself grateful for the weather's persistence, as the deserted streets allowed them to leave Prescott without attracting undue attention. The return journey began in contemplative silence, each rider absorbed in private reflections as their horses navigated the increasingly slick trail. Clara found her thoughts alternating between triumph at her newly secured legal status and apprehension about returning to the outside world as a legally recognized person, rather than a concealed dependent. Freedom, she was discovering, carried its own weight of responsibility. The return journey proved more challenging than anticipated. By mid-afternoon, the promised storm arrived with vengeful intensity, transforming the trail into treacherous mud that slowed their progress to a crawl. Thomas led them off the main path onto higher ground, navigating by landmarks and instinct as visibility diminished. "The creek crossing will be dangerous," he observed, rainwater streaming from the brim of his hat. "We'll push for Simmons's, but may need to make camp if conditions worsen." Clara nodded, her newly acquired legal document secured in oilcloth against her chest, more precious than any gold. The rain penetrated her clothing despite Thomas's lone slicker, yet she found herself strangely exhilarated by the elemental challenge. No longer property to be sheltered, but a person making her own way through adversity. As dusk approached, Thomas halted suddenly, raising his hand in warning. Through the curtain of rain, figures on horseback materialized on the ridge ahead, 3 men watching the trail. When Thomas shifted their course, the riders moved in parallel, maintaining distance but clearly tracking their progress. "Railroad men?" Clara asked, keeping her voice steady. Or hired guns, Thomas replied grimly. Either way, not friendly. He guided them into a dense stand of juniper, using the terrain and fading light to break the watcher's line of sight. For an hour they traveled in bone-chilling wet, until lights from Simmons's way station appeared through the gloom, a beacon of relative safety. The riders had not reappeared, but Thomas's vigilance remained undiminished as they approached the station. Stay alert, he murmured. Our friends may have simply gone ahead. Simmons met them at the door, shotgun cradled casually in his arms. Figured that was you, he said, ushering them inside. Three hard-looking fellows came through an hour back, asked specific questions about a cavalry officer and a masked woman. The interior of the station was empty except for Simmons, the usual evening travelers apparently deterred by weather. They move on? Thomas asked, helping Clara dismount in the shelter of the overhang. Simmons nodded. Claimed they were heading to Prescott, but their horses turned north after they thought they were out of sight. His roomy eyes narrowed. Toward your place, I'd reckon. Thomas's expression hardened. Jenkins will have reinforced security after your warning. The Turners have the children. Still, best not to linger, Simmons advised, taking their horses. Got fresh mounts in the back if you're wanting to push through tonight. Clara stepped forward, surprising both men. We should continue, she said firmly. I'll not have children endangered on my account. Thomas studied her with newfound respect. The trail will be treacherous in darkness. Then we shall be cautious, she replied simply. Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Not just respect now, but admiration. He nodded once. We leave in an hour, time enough for hot food and dry clothes. Inside, Simmons provided a private corner for Clara to change while he prepared a hasty meal. The physical comforts were welcome, but secondary to the urgent need to reach the children and secure the ranch. With each passing minute, Clara felt a growing sense of purpose. This was no longer just about her freedom, but protecting what mattered. The innocents who had welcomed her without judgment. Only after they had eaten and retired to their separate rooms did Clara fully process the day's significance. Seated on the narrow cot, official document spread before her in the lantern's glow, she traced the territorial seal and judicial signature that transformed her status in the eyes of society. A soft knock at the connecting door preceded Thomas's voice. May I speak with you briefly? Of course, Clara replied, carefully refolding the precious document. Thomas entered with characteristic respect for her privacy, remaining near the doorway rather than advancing further into her temporary domain. His expression conveyed both satisfaction and concern. The judge's warning about returning expeditiously merits consideration, he said. Railroad interests often employ less scrupulous methods when legal avenues fail. Clara nodded, understanding the implications. You anticipate potential confrontation at the ranch? I anticipate possibilities, Thomas clarified. Most will not materialize, but preparation prevents disaster when they do. The echo of his earlier philosophy reminded Clara of the consistent principles that guided this remarkable man. Captain Thomas Blackwell prepared for all contingencies, faced them directly when they arose, and protected those under his care with unfailing dedication. We'll depart at first light, she agreed. The children will be anxious for our return regardless of weather conditions. Thomas nodded approval, but lingered in the doorway, uncharacteristic hesitation evident in his posture. There is another matter I wish to address, he said finally. Clara gave him her full attention, curious about what could cause uncertainty in a man typically so decisive. In the judge's chambers today, Thomas began carefully, when you revealed your face, Clara tensed involuntarily, fingers rising to touch the mask she had replaced immediately after the judicial examination. I want you to know, Thomas continued, voice gentle but direct, that what I saw was evidence of extraordinary survival. Nothing more, nothing less. The simple statement, delivered without excessive sentiment or patronizing reassurance, affected Clara more powerfully than florid compliments might have. Thomas Blackwell had looked upon her scarred face with the same clear-eyed assessment he brought to all aspects of life, and found neither horror nor pity-appropriate responses. Thank you, she said quietly, the phrase again inadequate for emotions too complex for casual articulation. Thomas nodded once, acceptance rather than acknowledgement. We should rest. Tomorrow's journey may prove demanding in ways beyond weather conditions. After he withdrew, Clara removed her mask and washed her face in the basin of cool water Simmons had provided. For the first time in 15 years, she deliberately avoided neither touching her scars nor acknowledging their existence. They were simply part of her, neither defining feature nor shameful secret, but evidence of survival, as Thomas had so precisely observed. Not recovery or triumph or miraculous healing, simply survival. The continuation of existence despite forces that had attempted its extinction. In that context, her scarred face and Thomas's permanent limp represented the same fundamental human quality: endurance. As she prepared for sleep, Clara found her thoughts turning toward the future with unprecedented clarity. Legal independence created possibilities previously unimaginable. She could seek employment and establish her own household, travel beyond territorial boundaries, or she could remain at the Blackwell Ranch, helping raise 3 children who had lost their mother, supporting a man whose principles transcended frontier expediency, building a life characterized by purpose rather than mere existence. The choice itself represented the most profound gift of the day's proceedings. For 15 years, others had determined her circumstances, location, associations, invisibility. Now those determinations belonged solely to her. Rain continued its steady percussion against the way station's roof as Clara drifted towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring challenges, physical in terms of difficult travel conditions, and potentially more serious if the judge's warnings about railroad aggression proved prescient. But those challenges would be faced as a legally recognized, independent adult, rather than as property to be claimed and controlled. That distinction made all the difference. They departed Simmons's way station shortly before midnight, mounted on fresh horses selected for their sure-footedness in difficult conditions. The rain had diminished to a steady drizzle, and a waxing moon occasionally broke through the clouds, providing just enough light to navigate the treacherous trail. Thomas led them on a circuitous route, avoiding the main paths where the mysterious riders might be waiting. "We'll approach the ranch from the East Ridge," he explained during a brief rest. "Better visibility of the property, and Jenkins knows to expect us from that direction." Clara nodded, conserving her energy for the demanding journey. The unfamiliar exertion of extended horseback riding had awakened aches in muscles long dormant from years of confinement, yet she welcomed the discomfort as evidence of her expanding freedom. Physical pain seemed trivial compared to the years of emotional imprisonment she had endured. Dawn was breaking as they crested the final ridge overlooking the Blackwell Ranch. Thomas halted, surveying the property with tactical precision. Smoke rose normally from the chimney, and Thomas's most trusted hand, Jenkins, could be seen moving between barn and house with his characteristic unhurried stride. No signs of disturbance, Thomas observed, some tension easing from his shoulders. Jenkins would have signaled if there had been trouble. They descended the slope cautiously, Thomas still alert for potential ambush. When Jenkins spotted them, he raised his arm in greeting rather than alarm, further confirming the ranch's security. "Captain," Jenkins called as they approached, a lean man with the weathered features of a lifetime outdoorsman. "Glad to see you back. Had some visitors yesterday. 3 men asking after you and the lady. Didn't care for their manner, so I kept them outside the fence line." "You did well," Thomas affirmed, dismounting. "Any sign they returned?" "No, sir, but I've kept watch through the night. Turner sent word the children are well and ready to return home today." Clara felt a surge of relief at this news. Despite her physical exhaustion, anticipation of reuniting with the children provided renewed energy. The thought surprised her. How quickly she had come to care for these small lives, entrusted temporarily to her guardianship. By mid-morning, the wagon from Turner's farm arrived, bringing Jackson, Ruth, and Rebecca home. The children tumbled out with exuberant energy, rushing toward their father with excited accounts of their adventures. "We saw a fox with kits," Rebecca announced, clinging to Thomas's leg. "And Mr. Turner taught me to whittle," Jackson added proudly, producing a small, somewhat lopsided wooden horse from his pocket. Then Ruth spotted Clara standing uncertainly by the porch steps and broke away from the group, racing toward her with arms outstretched. "Miss Clara, did you see the judge? Did you get the special paper?" Clara knelt to receive the child's embrace, momentarily overwhelmed by the unquestioning acceptance. "Yes, Ruth, I received the special paper. Everything is properly settled now." "Does that mean you're staying forever?" Rebecca asked, joining her sister. Clara glanced up to find Thomas watching the interaction, his expression unreadable. That depends on many things, she answered carefully. Father said we should ask you proper, Jackson explained, approaching with more restraint than his sisters but equal intensity. He said it's your choice now because you're free. The simple statement, delivered with a child's directness, captured the profound transformation of her circumstances. She was free, not just legally, but in every sense that mattered. Free to leave, free to stay, free to choose. Thomas cleared his throat. Children, give Miss Clara some space. She's had a difficult journey. But Clara shook her head. It's all right, Thomas. Their honesty is refreshing. She looked at each child in turn. I would like very much to stay, if you all wish it. The twins responded with immediate cheers, while Jackson nodded solemnly, a smile spreading across his usually serious face. Thomas stepped forward. The children have made their preference clear, he said quietly. I hope you know mine aligns with theirs. Something warm unfurled in Clara's chest at his words, a sensation so unfamiliar she hardly knew how to name it. The day passed in settling back into ranch routines, though Thomas insisted Clara rest after their arduous journey. By evening, normalcy had largely returned, with supper preparations and children's lessons proceeding as before. Yet Clara felt a subtle difference in her position, no longer a guest received from charity, but a chosen member of the household. As darkness fell, Thomas checked the property with his usual vigilance, returning to find Clara seated by the fire, legal document in hand. Still concerned about its validity? He asked, joining her. No, she replied, marveling at its power, words on paper that transform a possession into a person. Thomas studied the flames. The law merely recognized what was always true. Your personhood existed long before Judge Wilson acknowledged it. The moment stretched between them, comfortable, yet charged with unspoken potential. Outside, the wind carried the last remnants of the storm eastward, clearing the sky to reveal a canopy of stars. The children will be asking for their story soon, Thomas observed. They've missed your tales. Clara nodded, fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of her mask. A thought had been forming since their return, crystallizing now into resolution. I think perhaps tonight's story might be different, she said. When the children gathered for their bedtime ritual, Clara seated herself in what had become her customary chair. Jackson arranged himself on the floor with the twins, their expectant faces turned toward her. Tonight, Clara began, I have a different kind of story. A true one about a girl who lived in darkness for so long she forgot the feel of sunlight on her skin. As she spoke, her hands moved to the knot securing her mask. With deliberate calm, she untied them one by one. This girl believed her scars made her a monster, because others told her so. The mask loosened, but she held it in place, continuing her narrative. Then one day a brave man showed her that scars are just evidence of survival, and 3 remarkable children showed her that true sight comes from the heart, not the eyes. With that, Clara lowered the mask completely, revealing her face to the Blackwell family for the first time. The left side remained transformed by fire, skin pulled tight in ridges of scarring from temple to jaw. The right side showed what might have been, delicate features unmarred by tragedy. The twins stared with undisguised curiosity but no trace of revulsion. Jackson's expression held something deeper, recognition, perhaps, of another soul who carried visible reminders of painful experience. And Thomas looked at her as he always had, with steady respect and something more that made her heart quicken, not despite her scars but with complete acknowledgement of them as part of her wholeness. You're still Miss Clara, Rebecca announced with certainty. Just without the itchy sack, Ruth added pragmatically. Jackson said nothing, but moved to sit beside her chair, his small shoulder pressed against her skirts in silent solidarity. Clara felt something within her shift and settle, like a dislocated bone finally returning to its proper place. Not miraculous healing, the scars remained, both physical and emotional, but acceptance, integration of all she had been and all she might become. Now, she said, voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat, shall I continue our story about the girl who found light after darkness? Later, after the children were asleep, Thomas found Clara on the porch, her face still uncovered beneath the night sky. He joined her without comment, respecting her moment of private contemplation. They accepted it more easily than I dared hope, she said finally. Children often see more clearly than adults, Thomas replied. They perceive essence rather than appearance. Clara turned toward him. And you? What do you see when you look at me now? Thomas considered her question with characteristic thoroughness. I see the same person I've known these past weeks. Courageous, intelligent, kind. A slight smile softened his features. Though I admit seeing your expressions directly rather than guessing at them through burlap is a welcome change. A small laugh escaped her, perhaps her first genuine one in 15 years. I'm discovering I have expressions I'd forgotten. They stood in companionable silence, watching stars emerge above the distant mountains. The future stretched before them, unwritten but rich with possibility. They once called you the beast in the sack, Thomas said quietly, but I believe they were blind to what truly matters. Clara nodded, understanding the truth in his words. Not miraculous beauty or tragic disfigurement, but the enduring spirit that had survived 15 years of darkness to emerge into light. Tomorrow, she said, I think I shall teach the twins to make biscuits. Jackson has expressed interest in geometry. The garden needs attention before first frost. Ordinary plans, normal life, the most extraordinary gift imaginable. Thomas nodded approval. A good beginning. And that, Clara realized, was exactly what this moment represented. Not an ending to her story, but its true beginning. The first chapter of a life reclaimed, written in her own hand rather than dictated by others. She touched her scarred cheek briefly, then lowered her hand. The cool night air against her skin felt like freedom.